Everyone, happy first news agenda of 2022. I'm Fleet Street Fox, and today I'm joined by the Mirror's online political editor, Dan Bloom. Morning, Dan.
Morning, how are you?
Fine, thank you very much. Now, this is the People's Paper Review, everybody, remember? So we'll get into the comments, ask us your questions. The best ones do get, and to you, Charles, the best ones do get a news agenda mug. So make sure they're good ones. So what have we got today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on what an overwhelmed NHS looks like, with at least one ambulance trust in the northeast now, according to a leaked document, advising 999 patients with suspected heart attacks to get themselves to hospital in a taxi or get a lift from friends. That matters because people with chest pains are supposed to see a paramedic within 18 minutes. And it's currently taking that trust in particular about 2 hours for an ambulance to get even to the most urgent cases. So, Dan, yesterday, the Prime Minister said he won't introduce any new restrictions to stop the spread of coronavirus. And he admitted that some trusts could be, and I quote, temporarily overwhelmed. Now, a dozen trusts have declared critical incidents. 8 say care could be compromised. He seems to be gambling that if there's not a big wave of COVID deaths, he can get away with this. But we do still face a lot of deaths, don't we?
Well, exactly. First, to take your things in turn, we do face a lot of death. It's just a question of how much and how much daily death is something that society can cope with against the other evil, as it were, of lockdowns. And then your point about gambling, yes, he's hoping that the cases won't rise to a level where the NHS is overwhelmed. And the problem with that is that we're now getting differing definitions of the NHS being overwhelmed. So you look at that spread there on the right, some people would say that that is the definition of the NHS being overwhelmed. You've got one quote in today's paper, which is the hospital is full. This is at Lancaster Royal Infirmary. We are running at 100% capacity. It's a case of one out, one in. And as soon as a bed is free, there's someone waiting to take the bed. The whole system is struggling. Now, the problem is Boris Johnson has acknowledged this. He said, as you said, some units will feel like they are temporarily overwhelmed, but he's claiming that the entire NHS as a national system might not be overwhelmed. And why is that important? Because the COVID winter plan, all of the COVID planning that has been done before has been about doing whatever it takes to stop the NHS from being overwhelmed. So now we're kind of walking a lot more of a tightrope than we were before, because we're saying it might be a bit overwhelmed in Blackpool this week and maybe Manchester this week and then maybe somewhere else next week, but the whole system will just about survive. And that's a very subjective way of looking at things.
It is. It's this subjective point of view of someone who's not going to the hospital in the northeast with chest pains, isn't it? It's all very well to say that the NHS nationally seems to be creaking but is doing okay. But if your particular local hospital that you need when you're ill is having this temporary overwhelming moment, then you're going to really suffer. Now, ask us your questions, get into the comments. Have you had experience of the NHS in the past sort of week, 10 days? How do you think it's doing? Do you work in the NHS? Tell us your experiences. Now, Sarah says, good morning, Sarah. The issue with ambulances has been going on for years. The bigger issue is people calling an ambulance when they could either go to A&E under their own steam in a car or taxi or should have seen their GP. Yes and no, Sarah. There has been lots of problems with ambulances, but this does appear to be a problem mainly with a staffing issue. From people having to isolate, we understand. Of course, lots of people don't get to see their GP. So it's a series of knock-on effects, it would appear. Now, if truth be told, the scientists say that the window for having any impact on this particular peak, for doing something to reduce the number of people with infections, has long passed. You needed to do that last week if you were going to do that. There's no way to reverse this tanker now, whatever it happens to involve. The Prime Minister said last night that despite the booster being widely available and that is the best way of keeping out of hospital and letting A&E deal with the car accidents and the broken legs and everything else they've got to do, 9 million people who could have had their booster haven't had it. So, Dan, what do we know about who these 9 million people are, why they haven't had it, and what the government's doing to encourage them?
Well, I guess you could split it into three categories, really. So Chris Whitty, the first category is anti-vaxxers with what I think Chris Whitty called mad ideas, who have conspiracy theories, will never get the vaccine, will never be persuaded, and they're sort of a loss that's been cut, if you like. The second category is people who were skeptical, people who can be persuaded but have concerns. They look at kind of failures of medical science in the past, things like the thalidomide scandal, and they remain to be convinced. And the work of the NHS is to try to convince those people that, on the balance and on all the trials and tests that have been done, that this is safe. And then the third group of people, rather interestingly, of course, are lots of people who got COVID in December and therefore couldn't get a booster, because you have to wait 28 days after you get COVID. So Gillian Keegan, the minister, this morning was saying actually there's quite a lot of people in that category who, might be champing at the bit to get their booster, but they can't get it until, say, mid-January or sort of end of January. So there's a very mixed picture there. And it's often, especially with the first two categories, it's often difficult to kind of work out which is which. Do people have sort of an honest skepticism that you could persuade them round and that they can listen to the scientists on, or do they think that the scientists are lying to them and therefore they will never believe them, which is a very different situation.
Exactly. They're different things, aren't they? And of course, if you've had Omicron in December and can't get your booster, then you should have some immunity from the disease at the moment anyway. So that part of the 9 million, however many it is, shouldn't be having a huge impact on hospital attendance and so on, as far as we know. Now, get into the comments, ask us your questions. What do you think about the booster? Have you had yours? Are you avoiding having yours, or you've had to delay it for some reason? Have you had problems getting your booster? It took me about a month to actually be able to get mine, even though I was trying very, very hard. Have had it now, of course, which is marvellous. But there are still people as well who are very determined to believe the things they see on various websites. This one is not immune to that, about the problems with the jab. So if you've got anything like that, any concerns, ask us. We'll do our best to help you. Now, there's a quote I just want to read you, which is from the Politico Playbook email that came out this morning, which is sort of a bit of a roundup of things that are happening in the news. And it's about the NHS being overwhelmed. Now, Sajid Javid, the health secretary, said a little while ago that would potentially mean a child in a car crash not getting treated in hospital. Now, if that is your standard for the NHS being overwhelmed, then there's an awful lot of things that come underneath it. A child getting cut out of a car crash, going to A&E, there's no one there to help you, or not even getting to A&E, that's very disastrous. But there's a doctor here who's saying it's something worse than that. The image of children not getting treated for car crashes is deliberately provocative. But the fact is that a child who waits 12 hours to be treated for a car accident is still receiving suboptimal care and may come to some significant harm because of it. To pretend they're substantially different things is nonsense. Similarly, to cancel operations and appointments again comes with such substantial accrued morbidity, which is what's happening, Dan, isn't it? In trusts up and down the country, they're delaying all the planned operations. That any suggestion services are not already overwhelmed seems to me entirely disingenuous. Is the Prime Minister, when he's talking about being temporarily overwhelmed in some places, but overall will cope, is he using some sleight of hand there to get over what may be a week or two of things being very sticky, without it looking like he has in fact overwhelmed the NHS?
Partly. There is also the issue that, of course, when one hospital trust is overwhelmed, it could request help from another or from elsewhere. And so as long as they aren't all overwhelmed at the same time, you could move your resources around the country. But I think perhaps NHS staff would be a little bit skeptical about how much that's really going to happen in practice, given they're all under so much pressure. And then there are other issues as well, like the fact that, a lot of people make this argument that, it doesn't matter that so many COVID patients are in hospital, because a lot of them would say, went in for a broken leg and then got COVID on the ward. So what does it matter? They're not seriously ill. Why are we worrying about this? Now, there's two parts to this. Yes, the number of people on ventilators has not shot up yet. Hopefully it won't. That is really good news. However, it's still a big deal to have a lot of people in hospital with COVID, because they have to be moved a lot of the time onto, say, a red ward or a COVID ward to stop COVID sort of ripping through the hospital to the people who are very vulnerable. And so you might find yourself at the other end of the hospital, not with the specialist who is treating your broken leg or whatever it might be. And the sort of flow of staffing and the efficiency of the hospital is just completely disrupted. And when you say flow of staffing and efficiency, it might sound rather boring to some of our readers, but in a hospital, those are the things that can contribute to life or death.
Efficiency. Yeah, if you're the one in the hospital bed, some efficiency is always nice. Now, Suzette says businesses are being advised of the double jabbed and being in contact with someone with COVID to test for 7 days. The lateral flow tests are non-existent. How are they going to go forward on this? I was speaking to a friend of mine at the weekend, Dan, who tested positive for COVID and is not allowed back to work until she's had a PCR test, and she cannot get a PCR test. So work is complaining at her that she can't come back, but they're telling her she can't come back and there are no tests. Keir Starmer says Britain's a country crippled by self-isolation. And there does seem to be some movement, though, Dan, on the self-isolation and the testing requirements. So what are you hearing? Idiots are causing the crisis who don't get vaccinated, as Richard quite rightly. Dan, what are you hearing about any changes that the government might make about isolation and testing? Because there is some movement.
Yeah, there's discussions going on today to remove that follow-up PCR test, that confirmatory PCR test that you have to get if you test positive on a lateral flow. Now, this would only be for people without any symptoms. So if you have symptoms, you still have to get a PCR test. But the difference it makes is twofold. First of all, it reduces the demand for the PCR test so that your friend, Susie, is more likely to be able to get one. And then the other one, the other reason is that because your isolation period sort of starts from when you get that confirmatory result, removing that step means that your 7 days or your 10 days isolation, depending on when you test negative, starts a bit sooner, and you have a couple of days therefore locked off the end because you're not waiting for that PCR result. Now, the big downside of that is the reason we were all getting PCRs, even if we'd already tested positive, was because it helps sequence the variants. It helps the authorities know how much Omicron there is in the system. Now, right now, that doesn't really matter because we've got so much Omicron, right? So it's dominant. So it's not going to make a huge difference if we know that, X number of people have it or not. When it is going to make a difference is in sequencing new variants, the thing that comes after Omicron. And, of course, there will be a thing after Omicron. Whether it's as serious, whether it's worse, whether it's better, remains to be seen.
Yeah, now Beth of Britain says, instead of a taxi to A&E, should it be taxi for Boris? Very quickly, Dan, there was lots of talk, wasn't there, before New Year about Boris Johnson's popularity and his ratings and possible moves in the Tory party. Is that going to happen this week or any time in the future?
The Tory party are a funny one, aren't they? Is that they're absolutely ruthless when they decide that they want to get rid of someone. But they don't do perhaps quite as much fighting in public as Labour do. I mean, they still do an awful lot, but it's kind of a very ruthless, like, you have a lot of people who will hold their powder dry for many months and then strike and try to make it a killer blow straight away. So at the moment, that leadership chatter has sort of receded, probably because you've got many tribes in the Tory party, many different people who don't like Boris Johnson for completely different reasons. You know, you've got some liberal Tories over here and you've got COVID skeptics over there. But the COVID skeptics have obviously, sorry, the lockdown skeptics, not COVID skeptics, apologies, have sort of receded a little bit because Boris Johnson is resisting any more restrictions. You know, they're quite pleased with the direction that this is going. So that's one flank of the attack on Boris Johnson, sort of leveling out and calming down a bit. Of course it could come back. Of course it could come back. But they're not making quite as much noise as they were 2 weeks ago.
Maybe there's some clues there about the Prime Minister's motivation. Now, has Johnson given up on COVID rather than face his own backbenchers? Reports this morning not following a positive lateral flow with PCR, as we were just saying. Is he giving in to the backbenchers rather than dealing with COVID? That's what Labour would say, isn't it, Dan?
Well, yes, he has to an extent done what many members of his cabinet and much of his backbench want him to do, because you know, there's an argument which many have made even before we had the vaccine, but becomes a stronger argument when you have a vaccinated population, that if we have to impose restrictions now, then what next? What's in the future? If we have to go into full lockdown despite having a vaccinated population, then what would happen after that? And after that, are we looking at on and off lockdowns for years? What precedent does it set? So you may or may not buy that argument. You may buy the argument that this is one wave that we need to get through and get over, and therefore it would be worth having these restrictions. But yes, for the Tory MPs, it's kind of an ideological question of liberty rather than just the practical, as well as just the practical questions that people have.
Yeah. Now, Robert, stop your hate speech about the unvaccinated, as Omicron is spreading through everyone. Only last week, someone I know tested positive who was double jabbed. You're quite right, Robert. Someone who is double jabbed can test positive for Omicron because Omicron has circulated widely in a population around the world which is mostly unvaccinated, who therefore provide a reservoir for the disease to mutate. It has got around the first vaccines. That means, as it's been fairly widely reported, you need your booster in order to protect you against Omicron. It doesn't stop you getting Omicron, but it massively reduces your chance of going to hospital or going to ICU or having a tube shoved down your throat while you're sedated in order that you can keep on breathing. That's why being double jabbed doesn't protect you against Omicron. That's why the NHS is currently being temporarily overwhelmed in some places and people are taking a taxi to A&E because there are too many people who don't have their booster jab or are unvaccinated entirely. It's not hate speech, it's fact speech. And if you don't like it, you shouldn't be watching my show. Now, we'll move on to the next one. Yesterday, Keir Starmer made a big speech setting out his alternative vision for government, which frankly at this stage would be just about anything and be welcome. Bring on the bunnies. Now, it went quite well, but then the PM called a 5 p.m. press conference and completely knocked it off a lot of the front pages. What a coincidence. Now, Dan, Keir Starmer set out a contract with Britain yesterday. What does that involve? Was it carved on a headstone? And do we have any idea how people have received it yet?
Sadly, the headstone has not made a comeback, this being the big slab that went in a car park last time. But it was what you might call a high-level speech. It was sort of big themes of, well, his 3 key principles were security, prosperity, and respect. There was a brief moment of panic where he paused at the third one and tried to remember it. But and he talked a lot about, you know, the symbolism was there. He stood in front of the flag. He talked about patriotism and actually about patriotism. not just being about the flag or thinking that Britain is brilliant and wanting pint bottles of champagne, but wanting to, spot the problems that exist in the country and fix them. So it's a sort of very conscious attempt to sort of reposition Labour perhaps away from what some voters think it stood for under Jeremy Corbyn, and to kind of present a very different message. Now there's a long running debate about this, what is patriotism and how do you define it? And actually, wasn't Labour patriotic before? But there are certain kind of touchstone things that the current leadership thinks need to be sort of emphasised and pushed out to impress the change on voters before perhaps bringing in a bit more policy, because it wasn't a policy speech. He wasn't saying, I'll raise benefits by X amount of money, or the minimum wage under Labour will be X, Y, Z. Although he has said in his New Year's message that there should be more of that, and he'll be spelling out his vision for Britain in 2022. And of course he has to, because we could have an election technically any time, but probably sort of mid-late 2023 or early 2024. So the time will start to tick down on that one.
Yes. Hopefully things will be looking better in a year or so for all of us, Omicron and otherwise, but you've got a massive lead, Keir. Please don't squander it. Right. After all this, there is some good news in the world, and we found it for you. Here it is. Now, having to live in fear of the local yobs is bad enough. Speaking out against them is pretty brave. But when those yobs then come back to your house and burn your car, your caravan and your house to the ground afterwards, you could be forgiven for thinking that human beings are pretty vile. But when all that happened to Sean Ivey and his family last March, their neighbours and friends rallied round with a, get this, £310,000 fund to rebuild their house from scratch and pay for rented accommodation while they waited to move back in. Now, Dan, they got to go back in before Christmas. There's Sean, his wife Kate, and their 2 young children going back in. Doesn't this just show that while there are scumbags who are very noisy and they cause the most problems for everybody else, they're a tiny minority compared to the nice, decent, brilliant human beings who are the massive majority of everywhere that we live on this planet, and humans aren't so bad, really, or something.
I should just leave it at that, shouldn't I? No, yes. It's a lovely story, and it's kind of amid all the shouting and hate and all the rest of it on Twitter and Facebook and the rest of it, of which we're all sometimes guilty, I suppose. It's a story of how the internet as well can help, because you have so many of these fundraising campaigns that kind of wouldn't get the momentum or the propellant that they would have before without kind of being able to be spread easily and be spread without kind of traditional media voices and the rest of it. So that was, it's kind of nice to see. It's lovely to see this guy in front of his house and see it rebuilt, and it's just nice to be able to read about people doing something good for a change rather than focusing on so much of the negative, which we have to focus on because it's our job, but
yes.
Isn't so much fun.
And here's an example of it. Stuart, who apparently doesn't want a new world order. What's wrong with you, Stuart? Can Dan Bloom tell us his medical qualifications, please? Now, I'm not aware that Dan's given anyone a medical diagnosis during this show. He's not expressed any medical opinions, and he's not here to express any medical, nor has he misrepresented himself as a qualified medical professional. But I'm going to guess that most of your medical qualifications, Dan, whatever they may be, involve listening to Chris Whitty carefully.
No medical qualifications. You can choose to ignore me if you like, but I'm not reporting Dan Bloom says this. I'm reporting Chris Whitty says this, and other doctors say this, and NHS doctors who are working on the ward say this. So, it's a free country. I'm not pretending to be a medic or anything like that, and you can read what we write if you like, and don't have to read it if you don't like. Though exactly. I would obviously prefer that you read it.
Yes, and you'll probably learn a bit more You do. Because what the journalists do and the random people on Facebook don't is when a medic says something, the journalist goes away and checks it. Now, Suzette says, taking away the PCR test, is that a good idea? Because the lateral flow tests aren't very reliable. There's a lot of false results sometimes on those LFTs, aren't there, Dan? So there's some concern. It's not an uncontroversial move. There is some concerns that dumping the PCR might free up space and make it easier to leave isolation, but you're relying on something that's not so good.
Yeah, so when LFTs first came around, they were not that reliable. They were quite good at showing, they were quite good at not going positive unnecessarily, the sort of false positives, but they were not so good at showing up every single case. And we know even now that, they're better at showing the cases that are most likely to infect other people than kind of every single positive case, when you're at your maximum infectiousness. Now, I haven't seen the detail of the studies that have come since then, or the development of the tests since then. You had the minister out today repeatedly saying, actually, lateral flows are quite reliable now. They're very reliable. But I don't know the figures, so I wouldn't like to opine on it. But that's a big question. We have to really know if they're going to scrap PCRs. It's hugely important that the lateral flows do pick up the vast majority of these cases.
Exactly. They need to be more accurate. And also, as Dan, you were already saying, the PCRs pick up, enable them to sequence the actual strain that you've got, so you know whether it's Omicron and the spread of it within the country. Now, Tanya. Oh, Tanya, why do you need a test if you know you have symptoms? Partly because Omicron can cause the same symptoms as a cold. That's how you know whether it's a cold or coronavirus, Tanya. Most likely have it. Use common sense. Stay home. Take paracetamol and lots of fluids. They won't help if you have blood clots in your lungs, Tanya. Paracetamol doesn't do anything for that. What's the point in going out and getting tested? What are you achieving by that, Dan? What does Tanya achieve by getting tested and telling people the result?
Well, I sort of see Tanya's point a little bit, because, if you know you've got COVID, why do you need the government to tell you? I get that. But the reason they want people to go and get tests is kind of, number one, for tracing variants. So the PCR test could get sequenced and find out, if there's going to be the sort of, if you've got a new variant or if you've got Omicron and so forth, and that helps the government gather data. And then the second point is just gathering data. It's, having an accurate record of how many people they know have COVID in the country, which, if they're going to bring in restrictions or something like that, helps inform that data. If millions of people were getting COVID at home and not getting the test in any way, either lateral flow or PCR, then obviously that makes it a lot more difficult because the government doesn't know what's going on.
Exactly. Now, Katrina says, why send you a question when you're being rude to your audience? So you can get read out on screen, Katrina. And I'm not being rude to my audience. I've been rude to, as far as I'm aware, the anti-vaxxer, who is not my audience, and slightly rude there to Tanya, perhaps, for which I apologise, Tanya. But I'm not rude. We are listening and discussing, and we brought up your comments so we could address it, which is not rudeness. Now, JC says, is this the right room for an argument? Who knows? We do tend to get a lot of them.
I think it's you, Susie.
It's probably me.
From you.
Yeah,
arguing with everyone.
Yes, I'm like a small god of war. So we do tend to get a lot of arguments in the comments, especially when we talk about vaccines, because it brings all the fannies to the yard, I'm afraid. But thank you for joining us, Dan. Thank you for explaining a lot of that stuff to us. We do hope that in amid the arguments and the rows, you got to learn some facts about today's news, and that you're not going to have a heart attack in the Northeast, because otherwise you're absolutely stuffed. See you all again next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda, when we'll probably still be rude and argumentative, but that's the way of life at the moment, it would seem, in 2022. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Bye-bye.